Here, the peculiar thing is, this is unique. Okay, how do we come into relationship to Jesus? Through baptism in his church. And now I come to my main point. It is because we must maintain the authority of these institutions, singling them out as distinct from all other religious institutions in the world, that the accent in our religious traditions, both the Jewish and the Christian, has been on the historical reference of these symbols. God at a certain specific time himself came and delivered a message to a specific person, and it's a matter of history to know that the tradition has come down without break from that source and been continuous. No one else in the world has this. It would be a good thing for them if they did have it. On the contrary, in the other part of the world, anyone can open his ears as a poet or his eyes as a poet and behold this wonder. There is a strain of this tradition in the West, a very strong one, the Hermetic strain, the Gnostic strain, the alchemical strain, where the gold is inherent in the very substance of life, and the goal of the rites is to bring this to your attention. Now, since in our religions the stress of the institution has been to validate itself by stressing the history, the symbols which in other parts of the world are used to awaken the spirit within, out of association with the institution, have been all applied to this historical means, this historical aim. This is a fantastic period we're in. It's one of the most religiously excited period the United States has enjoyed for a long, long time. And what's happening in the churches? They are losing their congregations. And who's getting the congregations? The gurus from India. They're running away with the chickens. And why? Because they're saying those symbols are pointing to you inside. Turn inside. Hold the image before you as a sign not of something that happened in the Near East 2,000 years ago, but as a sign of what is now within you. And this inward turning is what we're being invited to. And now in conclusion, let me just review very briefly some very significant details of our present situation on Earth. Consider the moonwalk. Who will ever forget that moment, who saw it on the TV, when that foot of a human being came down that ladder and touched the moon? Our mass media hardly recorded the event, really. The best recording of it was in Italy, in a kind of life magazine, a picture magazine there called Epoca, which devoted 9 issues to just that event, the biggest thing in the world of that year. And there was an Italian poet, Giuseppe Ungaretti, who is pictured in one of those editions, pointing with excitement to the television screen. And he says, "This is such a night as never existed in the world." And then he wrote a poem, a little 2-line poem, not to the moon, but to the earth, as seen from the moon. And this is what the poem said. "What are you doing, earth in heaven? Tell me, what are you doing, silent earth? Stand on the earth and the moon is in heaven, the first of the ranges of Dante's heavens. Stand on the moon and the earth is there. Not only that, is the most beautiful of the heavenly spheres. There's no other mythology. There is no mythology earlier than our day that does not make a distinction between the heaven realm and the earthly realm. Now we know that the earth is up there." And when those astronauts were coming back, ground control asked, "Who's navigating now?" You know what the answer was? Newton. The laws in Newton's head were the laws that governed that flight, and they're the laws that are in your head and my head. Kant asked the question, how can we measure space here and know that those measurements will be good over there for measuring space over there? This is a big problem. It's because the space is right in our heads. We didn't know how deep that foot was going to go into the moon, how heavy the dust. But those men knew exactly how much energy to project in order to guide the missile around in a space curve that had been measured through a space that no one had ever visited before. Not only do we carry the space, all the space of the universe in us, but we know now that the deities that we thought were up there are projections of our own visions. So the whole thing is right here in man. We have not been breathed into the earth, we've been born out of it. We are the senses, the sensibilities, the consciousness of earth. Just as our bodies, our sight is located in our eyes, and our whole body sees through our eyes, so does the whole of the earth experience the sensual world through us, who are the organs. And this earth itself is a crystallization out of space. So we have come from the earth, which has come from space, and is there any wonder that the laws of space are in our own very bodies? We come forth from our mothers with a zeal for food, and there's food there. With lungs to breathe, and there's breath there. We're just part of coordinates of this thing, which is this miracle. It's a tremendous miracle. And then the next thing that's happened is, from up there on the moon, it's a tiny Earth. Buckminster has called it the spaceship Earth. And no longer do we have these little marked off horizons of this culture against that culture. The miracle of our technology has turned this into one society, so that it's now a monstrous thing for any society to teach that it is the true society and all others are secondary. There's only one society now, it's the earth. You can't hold love for here and be taught to project your hate out on others. There's another law. Every mythology up to now has seen the in-group as the lovable true one and the out-group as something inferior. That's past. And finally, there is no fixed law for your moral conduct either. What was a virtue 2 decades ago is a vice now. This problem is being faced, it was faced with the divorce laws some long time ago, and then came the laws of contraception, and now abortion comes along. It's the society that's changing this as a result of what is good for the earth. And so every one of us is, as it were, thrown out on his own. It's a free fall. There's no ropes you can hang on to. You're creating the future in every moment of your life, and every one of us is doing that. No two human hands are alike. Every brain has something like 18,000 million cells. There are no two brains alike. There are no two human brains alike, no two human beings alike. And so what is good for you is not good for me, and vice versa. So here we now have this constellation of people in a secular society which does not force you to believe a certain specific mythology. All they ask is that you don't annoy your neighbor too much and pay your taxes. And meanwhile, you can have your own mythology, consort with your own friends, your own dreams, and open up your own life. There is a little episode from the Grail legends that to me epitomizes this situation. It appears in the Cuesta del Saint Graal, which is a early 13th century Grail romance. The knights of Arthur's court are seated in the great dining hall, and Arthur has it that no meal can be served until an adventure has occurred. Well, in those days, adventures did occur, so nobody went hungry very long. And on this particular occasion, the Grail itself appeared in the hall, covered with a great veil. Then it withdrew, and everyone was simply in rapture. And King Arthur's nephew, Gawain, stood up and he said, I propose a vow. I propose that every one of us go forth to behold that Grail unveiled. And now here's the text that I want to give you. They thought it would be a disgrace to go forth in a group. Each entered the forest at that point which he had chosen, where it was darkest, and there was no way or path. No way or path. 13th century Europe. Because where there is a way or path, it is someone else's way. And out of this we get a sense of that peculiar yearning that is characteristic of the Western soul, the Western spirit, a yearning for the fulfillment of something that is unknown. Our mythology, so to say, is a mythology of quest. And what is it we're questing for? It's the fulfillment of our own potentials, which are unique within us, and which we know, when fulfilled, will be a boon of some sort, as the maturation of any being is to the world in which we live. Now, I'll conclude with a little Hindu story that tells something the same tale. This is the story of a tigress who was pregnant and hungry. And she came upon a little herd of goats and pounced strenuously at these goats, who scattered, and she brought on the birth of her little one. And with that, she died. Well, when the goats came back, what they found was a dead tigress and a little just-born tiger. Now, these goats had very strong parental instincts, and they adopted the tiger, who grew up thinking he was a goat. He learned to bleat. He learned to eat grass. But the grass wasn't very good for his digestive system, which couldn't handle all the cellulose and all that, nor could his sharp teeth grind it properly. And so he grew up into a pretty miserable specimen of his kind. And when this little wretch reached adolescence, a great male tiger pounced on the herd, and it scattered. But this little fellow was a tiger, and there he was standing there. The big tiger looks at him. He says, "You may say you're living here with these goats?" And the little one goes, "Meh," and he nibbles a bit of grass. Big fellow is mortified. He buffets him about a little bit, and all he gets are these silly responses. So he takes him by the nape of the neck to a pond. The water is perfectly still. Now, the Indians say that our mind is like a pond rippled by a wind. It is always in rippling, in movement. And the goal of yoga is to make that mind stand still, so that all the broken images that appear on the rippling waves will be brought together, and you'll see the one image that is reflected in all of those. So this little fellow looks into the perfectly still water, and he sees his own little tiger face. And the big fellow puts his face over, and he says, "You see, you've got the pot face of a tiger. You're not a goat. You're like me. Be like me." The guru, be like me. So the little one, he's beginning to get something. The message is coming through. He's brought next to the den of this tiger, where there are the remains of a recently slain gazelle. Big fella takes a big chunk of this, and he says, "Here, have it, slug." The little one backs away. He says, "I'm a vegetarian." The big fella says, "None of this nonsense," and he takes this and shoves it down his throat. He gags on it. The text says, "As all do on true doctrine." Well, then the true doctrine gets into him. He feels the activation of his blood and his nerves, having eaten his own proper food, and the spontaneity of his own nature takes over. And he gives a little tiger stretch, and a kind of preliminary tiger roar comes out of him, kind of tiger roar A21, something like that. And the big fella says, "Now there we are. Now we go into the forest and eat tiger food." And the lesson, of course, is that we are each of us a tiger living with all these goats. And the social scientist speaks of our goat nature, but the symbology of myth is the way to the discovery of our tiger face. So as my students used to say when I would give them this one, put a tiger in your tank. And that's my wish to you all for this evening. Now, I'm perfectly willing to accept questions as long as you want to give them, but this releases everybody who can now depart without shame or anything. Just go away if you don't want any more, and those who do, deliver questions to me, and I'll answer as long as you can stand it. Those who are over there who want to stay might just as well move in here if you want to. It's a little easier to communicate. Well, does anyone have a question to pose to me? Yes.
Yeah, you were talking about the four functions of the myth.
Right.
And I don't quite understand a real distinctive first, that is the mystical function, and the fourth, the psychological.
Let me speak of the second, third, and fourth first. The second presents an image of the universe, what we call the cosmos, the image of the macrocosm. The third presents the image of the microcosm, what your psychology is. And the basic notion in these mythologies is that these are related to each other. Then the society, through its order, symbolizes to you the order of the cosmos and the order of your own psyche, which are the same. It was in the period of the early temples of Mesopotamia that the priests, keeping their records, recognized that the planets moved through the fixed constellations of the zodiac at a mathematically determinable rate. And the notion arose at that time of a cosmic order, a mathematically registered cosmic order. And it was thought that it would be well for the society to adapt itself to that order and to imitate it. So that our principal religious festivals to this day come at the times of the great crises of the seasons. Equinox, spring and fall. Winter solstice, summer solstice. Those are the main seasons. And the society puts itself in accord with the universe, and it's thought that you, putting yourself in accord with the society, are also in accord with the universe and at the same time with yourself. Those are the three main images: macrocosm, microcosm, and what I call the mesocosm, the in-between cosmos of the society, which tells you about that order. Then you must not think of these simply as mechanical facts. Behind them is a mystery, a dimension of wonder. You may know when spring is coming, and fall coming, and the winter, and so forth. But you must also feel the wonder of this. And that is the religious dimension here. That's why I call that the mystic dimension. And the other three, then, are the aspects of this cosmos. Now, it's a wonderful thing in those ancient worlds to get this feeling of the great unity. And this is why the people in a traditional culture like the Indian culture, even though they must submit to the most rigorous ritual laws, they are convinced that they are putting themselves in touch with their own nature by obeying those laws, and thus with the nature of the universe. So there's no conflict between the individual and the society. The individual feels that when he is in accord with the society, he is in best accord with himself and with the world. Does that answer the question? That's very nice. The peculiarities of the way we behave in time and space are different in our cases, but the time and space a priori forms are essentially the same in both of us. Not only the laws of time and space, but the laws of logic in our head, and not only that, but the laws that govern our feelings, these a priori laws. Now, as I stated it there, and that's a wonderful question, I was stating it in the simple, banal, flat way, let's say, of the Kantian representation of this. Now along comes Oswald Spengler, who says just what you say, that in the different culture realms, space is not experienced in the same way. Space is experienced but with a different accent, a different tension in the various cultures of the world. And it might well be, going still further, that in each individual there is a different experience of space and time. I once had a friend, rather funny little friend, who was an artist, and I was with him one day at the seashore, and he was painting something. And he looked with this eye, then he looked with this eye, and he says, the green that I see with this eye is different from the one with this eye. Now, which is right? Well, I said, how am I to know which is right, or whether the green I see is the same as the one you've got there? Now, it might be that that kind of differentiation extends also to the experiences of time and space. But the interesting thing is that all of the men at ground control were able to put together a system for getting that rocket around the moon that worked, so that the rocket could come down within a couple of 100 feet of the boat that was waiting for it. It must be that these elementary forms of sensibility, time and space, also the notion of causality and the categories of logic, are in common enough in all of us to be essentially dependable from one person to another. That must be what.
Isn't Newton basically wrong, though? As far as the details of the system, right?
Oh, well, what we know now with the new mathematics in relation to more distant space and all, but here's the human being making these extrapolations out of a basic principle that these men recognized were the laws of Newton's brain that worked going around the moon. Now, if you're going to go to Betelgeuse or some of the great distant galaxies, it might be something else would come into play here. But I think just for this sphere of our galaxy, one can say what is implied by this Newtonian point.
What bothers me is you sound a little Cartesian with this separation of mind and matter. And I almost get the impression that you're going back into yourself and being a tiger and neglecting all the goats is almost the same hang-up that Descartes got, and that was completely abstracting and separating man from the whole world around you. Especially, like you say, there is more than just the tigers and the goats on Earth.
Well, the tigers are the goats, and the goats are the tigers, and what I said before, each of us is a tiger among goats. The goats aren't there, they're all tigers. when you have a little children's anecdote like this of the tiger among goats, and the lesson is given that we're all tigers, then we're all goats in our social aspect and tigers in our interior. We are two things at once. We're two things at once. Now, also, when I speak about man's mind and the nature world is a function of man's mind and vice versa, and these two are not separate from each other. It may sound as though they are as I'm speaking, but if the laws of space are in the mind and the mind is moving through space, you've got a paradoxical situation here. They are aspects of each other. This is a basic thought in the Oriental systems. The notion that we're separate from each other is a secondary notion. Schopenhauer asked this question: how is it that a human being can so experience the pain and danger of another that, forgetting his own safety, he can fly spontaneously to that other's rescue? When I was in Hawaii last summer, there was a very strange thing happened. There was a young fellow who decided to commit suicide, and he went up to this great cliff that's called the Pali, and he was going to jump over. He was sitting there trying to get himself together to do that. And a police car came by and saw him there, and one of the policemen jumped out of the car and grabbed him just at the moment that he jumped. The policeman had to reach over a fence. That fellow jumping pulled the policeman with him, and the policeman was about to go over, and he didn't let go. And the other one got out of the car and just in time caught him. And when he was interviewed later, he said, I couldn't let him go. He knew he was going over himself. This to me was an enormously heroic act. And this is what Schopenhauer asked. How can that be? How can it be that a human being can so forget the first law of normal nature, self-protection, that he will do a thing like that spontaneously? There was no rule to tell this man he had to do that. No one would have blamed him. He said, I could not abandon him. And Schopenhauer's answer is that this is an expression of the truth, that you and I are, on a deeper level, one. And the experience of separateness is secondary and is a function of time and space, which is secondary. The truth is antecedent to that. And this experience he calls the experience of compassion, which he says is the base of all truly moral action. And moral action consists in transpersonal commitment beyond your own little personal center. And the mythic imagery is there to carry you past your center in small degrees, not to that extreme, but in the details of life, to carry you past your ego-centered concerns of fear and desire for your own life. Now, when I say a thing like that, I'm saying that the experience of separateness, of me inside and nature outside, is a secondary field of experience. And the degrees of interpreting it are some superficial, others deep. We go from Newton to Einstein and so forth and so on in the mathematics of space and time. But the main point is that this space and time is exactly the field which separates us from each other, and our truth, in that sense of the Indian idea, Tattvamasi, you are that. Your true being lies behind all conceptualization, all the forms of sensibility. This is the message you get on all of those tracks. That was the main point I was trying to make tonight.
I didn't get it. I got almost the opposite. That you were stopping and pushing into the relationship.
Yeah. Well, then I was badly expressing myself. Yeah.
Can you offer an interpretation of any of the myths that are given to us by science fiction, for example, Dr. Cooper's 2001? I've heard it said by a number of science fiction authors of science fiction writing the myths of our time.
Well, I had the pleasure of hearing that the author of the book, 2001, had told the author of the movie, 2001, that before engaging in the enterprise of the movie, he should read Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. So I think it was a wonderful movie. But what there is in there is, well, I'll tell you why I think it was wonderful. I suppose most of you have seen it, more or less. It starts with those Australopithecines, those sort of proto-hominids, and most of them are engaged in the activities of most primates and animals. Their political life, fighting. Their economic life was scurrying around for food. Their social life, picking fleas off each other. But just one of them was struck by the wonder of a curious panel. He went up and touched it. And what turns animals into men and men into heroes is not economics, politics, and picking the fleas off each other, but the sense of wonder. And this same fellow, or these same creatures, began using weapons, tools. This was an idea that comes from the South African finds of the little Australopithecines. These little creatures looked almost like apes, but it was found that some of them had holes knocked in their heads by a double kind of weapon, and what it was a thigh bone of a gazelle, so that man is identified by his ability to kill other people. And that weapon, that bone killer, flies in the air and becomes the great spaceship. And when the spaceship gets to the moon, there's that same panel. And when it's on the way out to Saturn or whatever it was, Jupiter, there's that same panel floating in the sky. It's the inspiration of awe, man, the aspiring man, not the economic man, that brings about the growth and adventure of human consciousness. That's the sense of that book on one level. And the other is a kind of theory about reincarnation, which I thought was rather amusingly represented there, where we find him finally in heaven after he has extinguished himself. But I must confess, I'm not a reader of the science fiction literature. I've just received a whole bibliography from a young man who said I better get going on it if I want to stay up with the world. So perhaps if I come back here in a couple of years, I will have boned up on that and will be able to talk about books that were not based on my book. And I'll know a little more about it.
Is there any equivalent in Eastern philosophy or mythology
I didn't hear the very last word. The Übermensch, what about him? Is pity. Well, I don't think Nietzsche's pity is the same thing as compassion. I think what he was angry at there was Wagner, but I'm not sure about that, and I wouldn't know what to say about it. When you turn from Indian religious writing and from Oriental religious writing to their political writing, you see this absolutely ruthless realpolitik, and that may have been the mood that was in Nietzsche's mind when he said that. When you read, well, the Gita, for instance, the Bhagavad Gita, that's a warrior book. Get in there and fight without fear or desire for the fruits of the fight, but be in there because it's your duty. Don't be afraid of the fruits of the fight, either for yourself or for others, but just perform the duty without fear and without desire. That's going beyond pity. You get this in the Chinese Book of the Lord Shang and the Sun Tzu's Art of War. Such wonderful sayings as this: he who does what his enemy would be ashamed to do has the advantage. I would keep this in mind when we're thinking about the spiritual Orient. Their political books breathe a quite different air, and they're much more in the way of that that mood in Nietzsche. Nietzsche's inconsistent in his philosophy, and he prides himself on that. He speaks of what he calls his perspectivism. He says no dancer would stand simply in one position. Why should a philosopher? So now and then he comes in from this angle and from the other. Yes, well, this political philosophy represents also a psychological stance. What I was trying to suggest was that that particular psychological stance of Nietzsche's represents the hardness and ruthlessness of the fighting animal, you might say. But I don't know. I don't feel prepared to talk about this, and I'm going to go home and think about it. I think it's a very good question. It may be that he was in reaction there against Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer was his master, you might say. And then the Schopenhauer mood was continued in Wagner. And with the break from Wagner, he makes some very violent statements that, of which this may be one. But I thank you for that, and I recommend a little reading in that direction all around, perhaps. Yes, sir? Well, I thought I said those at the end. I did say that we were each on our own journey. We go into the forest where there's no way or path. Each is different from the other. And I put that at the end specifically to give the accent to the Western peculiarity which distinguishes our way from the Oriental, and to put it very crassly, I think of this Western way as representing you might almost say, evolutionary advance over the other way where people do not respect the individual. I think one of the things in fighting Oriental people, the central government of an Oriental country has no regard whatsoever for the individual. The way people are liquidated. I mean, what China is doing in Tibet right now, it's absolutely incredible and unbearable to read. The individual doesn't mean a thing. And this is something one feels in the Orient. I mean, in India, for heaven's sakes, the tough indifference to the suffering of people there, and such suffering as you can hardly bear to look at, is an awful thing to experience. And the Orient, again, it's we who have been very careful about even animals, the humanity to animals. You don't find that in the Orient at all. I think this is something very much on our side. But what we have lost is this sense of, through our religions, the sense of the immanence of divinity. We have what I call mythic dissociation. God is transcendent. And we are in relation to him, provided we are in relation to a certain social unit. This, I think, is something is not proper to Europe. This comes to us from the Near East. It belongs to another culture world. And I think one of the problems, and you find it in our artists and literary men, is to recover the essential European respect for individual uniqueness. The Oriental is a person who is identical with a group. His individuality is absorbed in the group, not here. At least this is what I'm feeling in the mythic situations here.
I think we should take maybe 2 more questions and then give Professor Campbell the night off. It's been very
I see 2 here. First, I'll take ladies, since ladies first, and then the gentleman. Well, I'm not arguing with you there. I think those are all very relevant observations. I will say that what I did say was that the rituals of those primitive people were repetitions of what they took to be the original founding murder. And by repeating the original act which gave birth to the world, they're refreshing its force and reanimating the world. Now, if you go to the Roman Catholic Mass, that is regarded as a repetition of the sacrifice on Calvary. It's the same principal idea, that the ritual is not just an imitation, but it is the reenactment. That's the doctrine of the sacrifice on Calvary. And through that, there is refreshed the atonement which was achieved on Calvary, and one participates in the service. The ritual service of that kind is, as it were, something that erases time and puts you back in the mythological domain, which is really a domain of your own spirit. Now, with respect to science and awe, the scientist is describing the world. But the world that he describes is something that certainly excites awe. And if you've known any astronomers or physicists, these are men completely in awe of what they're discovering. Read Einstein, read Schrödinger, read Niels Bohr, and you have what would be called religious attitudes toward the miracle of galaxies beyond galaxies. Or yourself, look through a telescope, look through a microscope, and if you don't feel awe from what science is showing you there, I'd be surprised. It's not that the scientist himself communicates awe, but he renders to you an image that certainly is susceptible to to which you should be susceptible. And I mean, it makes the little 2x4 universe in Genesis look like a kindergarten school. Wait, there's only one more question. Yes, sir? Well, I will comment on 2 or 3. I think James Joyce, definitely. I think William Butler Yeats, definitely. I think there was a good deal of it in T.S. Eliot also. There's a whole constellation there. And the imagery those men are using is precisely the imagery of our inherited mythological tradition, and they're applying it to the experience of the world in which we're living. They're doing it. My position is that these men are the sages, the rishis, the prophets of the contemporary moment, converting our experience of the phenomenology of our own existence into its mystery dimension, letting us see what it is and its relevance to the mystery out there and the mystery in here. When Eliot writes of the still point of the turning world, he's talking about all this. And another thing about these men is they know very well both the Oriental and the Occidental images, and they know the analogs, and they know what the values are on these sides. These are great, great teachers. All right, my friends, thank you all.